Welcome to Soul Talks with Prophet and Paul, conversations on how the soul lights the way through life, relationships, and business. I'm Paul Wozniak, a realtor, a yogi, a DJ, a dad.
I'm Alison Prophet. I'm a business coach, a rock climber, and a joyful human being. Hi,
thanks,
Paul.
thanks for joining me again, Allison. I'm so excited for today's topic. And
Same.
off camera and off recording, we were wondering whether or not the topics that we bring are too heavy. And I have to say no. I mean, I think we're here to talk about things that matter, that impact us, and probably impact people who are listening and watching right now as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because life is fun, but it also has heavy moments, and it's the duality that makes it all make sense, I think.
Yeah, I probably want to drop maybe one of my favorite guys that I follow on TikTok. He talks about the Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius and all these
Yeah.
ancient, wise people, sages. And I'm probably going to bring a couple of quotes in from stuff I've been learning in the vast wealth of knowledge that is TikTok. But you're celebrating grief today, and I'm doing it along with you. So thanks for wearing the feather boa.
Yes. Well, I was sharing that there is a song, and this is a phrase that's out there, but I heard it in a song called Glitter. And there's a line in it that talks about how grief is like glitter. And it struck me in the heart because if you think about glitter, in fact, I talked about maybe I would throw some confetti, and it was like, I don't want to clean that up
What's going
because
to end up in your keyboard?
it'll get in my keyboard. Exactly. And it'll just you'll find it everywhere. And that's like, what a beautiful metaphor for grief. It's this thing that shows up where you don't expect it to. You might think you got it all cleaned up, and then you'll find a little piece of it on your desk or like behind your ear, or like somebody's like, what's that on your eyelid? It's like, oh, there's some more glitter. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
And I just love that concept of like grief is like glitter. And so we're here today. We're going to talk about the topic of grief a little bit. And I'm wearing a feather boa, not to celebrate grief because it's fun, but there's different kinds of grief. In fact, um, I think I was watching something that had Brene Brown in it. And I believe she was I'm going to confirm that in a moment, but I think she was talking about that there's like 7 or 9 different kinds of grief, or there's probably more than that. I'm going to Google that right now. We don't always prepare for our podcast because you can't always plan and prepare for life. So our podcast is a mirror for life, but there's different kinds of grief. And we want to talk about how your soul can light the way through it.
Yes.
What are some of the things that like jumped out at you, Paul, from our preliminary conversation today that just really struck you?
Grief is my story for the past 5 years. And to harken back to the TikTok guy that I follow that talks about the Stoics, he mentioned how Marcus Aurelius said that change is an inevitable part of life, and grief is often a reaction to change. Change in the form of loss, I think is the form that it takes here. My life started changing in 2015 whenever I had my son, and my son is, probably my greatest source of joy. Last night I was laying there watching Star Wars Droid Tales, the Lego version, with my son in one arm and my girlfriend in the other, and it was just like, I was just like, holy cow, talk about happy place.
Mm.
But I think that perhaps the very smallest point of grief there was grieving the loss of the life that I had before, because life after children is nothing like life before children. And then in 2016, I lost a job that I had for a long time because the world of radio was downsizing. So everybody who had a high salary from the old days was squeezed out. And then
Yeah.
a couple years later, I got divorced, and through that divorce, my entire relationship with my nuclear family changed. I didn't handle all the divorce that, as well as I should have. So I lost a couple of friends. I lost, a good bit of network that I had in the past. And then very recently, it came to a head with, full scale depression, that was
Mhm.
crippling. And I don't think that I went into divorce or fatherhood or losing a job with the idea of preparing to grieve, giving it the space that it needed, and potentially the therapy that it needed and the help that I needed and all the things that it needed. Um, my form of grief is not the grief of losing a person in the form of death. It was the form of changing. And so this is, I do think that, a grief that once I'm through it, my life, in the future has great potential, and really, is something that can be difficult and hard to deal with for a while, but then should lead to something better.
Yeah. So I took a moment to do a little bit of like super on the fly research, and so Brene Brown has had some conversations with David Kessler, who's a grief expert, and he talks about how we can find meaning like on the other side of grief.
Mm.
And I think that that's such a beautiful thing that we can kind of reflect on, that there's this loss of this stuff and you can't change those things. Like it's like you can't live in the rear view mirror,
Right.
and you also can't live like too far out through the windshield, but it's a little bit of that kind of, how are you experiencing and feeling that grief, and then what can you do with it. And I think that if you've never had a grief experience, you don't know what it's like. I've been very privileged and haven't had lots of loss in my life, up until the last couple of years. I would say like 5 years ago, where I lost my job, and then all the moves, and multiple job losses, multiple moves, multiple failures of starting my business, and going through my divorce, similar to you, Paul, right? Where it's like you have all these things, these unexpected things that aren't like loss of life or like a lot like somebody died, but when we have those major life events, there's parts of ourselves that die with it.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that can happen sometimes is, by the way, we're not experts on this, we're just humans that have had
Yeah. We're just
experiences. And
rapping.
yeah, and I think the other thing that can happen is we might want to hold on to the bits of us before that experience, before that loss, because it was easier. We didn't have to feel the feelings. And that really was the catalyst for this conversation today. I experienced something that happened this weekend, triggered me. And it was a very unexpected thing. It was literally a
Mm,
comment that somebody made while I was rock climbing.
mm,
And it in some ways, in my mind, right, I don't know that this was true, but my mind made up this is a man that's putting power dynamics on me and trying to control my actions in certain ways. And it so unexpectedly triggered me. And as I was having, this experience, one of the things I remember saying, and luckily there were two of my guy friends that were there that know me, and this was a person that didn't know me. There was a lot of people that were in this climbing group, and there was this thing that I kept saying to them of like, I don't want to be feeling this way. This never would have triggered me like this before. I
oh,
just want to go back to before this happened.
yes.
So it's like this
Yes.
holding on to this thing. And that's not going to help me, because my sexual assault happened. And that there's a grief, right? There's a grief of just the me before then. And I think that when we think about grieving, there's so many different stages to it, and there's so many different kinds of it. And it's like glitter. You think you got it cleaned up, and then it shows up.
Yeah. Well, I want to say that I think that it's really natural and okay for you to have that feeling of, I don't want to feel this way.
Totally. Yes.
You know, I mean, that sounds just about as natural as it can be,
Yeah.
because, you know, that's a tough thing. But, you know, to your point, it has happened.
Right.
And now
Yeah.
you know, all the things that happened to me have happened.
Yeah.
And so now, you know, what am I doing about it?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think it's not much.
Well, some days you don't have the energy to clean up the glitter, right? Some days you're like, oh, I'm never going to get it off. I'm just going to leave it there.
Yeah.
But I think this idea of like, I would love to compel our listeners to just be curious about grief and think about like those moments of grief that you've had, like what has helped you feel loved and supported the most. When I was working in HR, one of the things as I went through my coaching program that I really realized is that I always had a tissue box in my office. And when an employee or manager, or somebody would come into my office, because my office was a place where people would come to grieve, right? Like
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
got a write up or they had something happen in their family or they were frustrated with their manager or their employee. So my my office was a place for people to come with their grief, and it was my job in some ways to hold it, which it's like I didn't really notice that until I wasn't in it anymore, that there was a lot of grief holding that I did. And when I was going through my coach training program, they were talking about the importance of feeling things and allowing people to feel things. And somebody said that like when you hand a tissue to somebody who's crying, you may be showing them that you're not comfortable with their tears.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting.
Huh. Yeah.
So what I started to do was, I mean, I had the tissues in my office, but I wouldn't grab for the tissue box,
Yeah.
but it was in eyesight. So if
Yeah.
they needed to grab it, they could, but it wasn't for me to give it to them.
That's a great
Um,
metaphor for holding space.
yeah, because often, you know, we're doing that because it's a sign of love and compassion.
Yeah.
But our tears are telling us something. Like there are different types of tears. And so tears actually have a healing, they have a healing thing in them. And when I learned more about the science of tears, like go Google that after this episode, like the science of tears, it's really, really interesting. There's actually, you know, different kinds of things that show up in our tears depending upon what it is that our body is emotionally trying to express. Like it could be pain tears, it could be sadness tears, it could be joy tears, right? There's, if you think about it, there's tears that show up, there's memory tears, right?
Yeah.
And so like it's a part of our body's beautiful makeup, because we're these beautifully designed beings. Like tears are designed to be doing something, so
Mm.
let them fall.
Yes.
And so like learning more about those emotions and that tears are actually a tool for expressing. For me, I've I've learned to not, and I don't do it well all the time, but like to not apologize for my tears and just let them fall, right? Sometimes I'll use a tissue to like wipe the snot out of my nose, but like just letting those tears fall, because there is something really cathartic about that. Um, and when you have more awareness around what are your emotions doing, and that's part of the work that I do. Like I know Paul, you're always like, should we talk more about like the work you do? And it's like, well, I feel like that just comes out,
Yeah.
is like teaching people some of these things so that when it's happening to you, you can have more consciousness about it. Like we don't want to get stuck in our grief. We don't want to be stuck in like a pile of tears all the time. But if you're actually allowing yourself to express it, then be curious about it. You're having that emotion at like a higher level of awareness so that you can get curious about like what happened. Like I was able to unpack what happened in this situation, and even like look at that person that made that comment, which was maybe there was some inappropriate stuff there. Like looking at him just as a human, right? Not as a human that said something that impacted me, but like what was going on for him. And then also being like, he was a jerk. Like you can experience all those things all at the same
Yes.
same kind of breath, right? It's like
Yes.
you can judge somebody, but then if you have that opportunity to then say, and also what if this?
Yeah.
Um, and then also holding that space for ourselves, like, oh, and also like, what if this situation that happened was a really important part of my healing? And also an important part for me to have a different level of perspective on like, where does this grief in, specifically a sexual assault trauma, like where does it show up? And then how does it impact our ability to do our business? Like I was supposed to come home from that climbing excursion yesterday and I had a bunch of work that I was going to do and I was zonked out. My nervous system was shot.
Yeah.
I was so tired. I was like, I'm not going to do that work today. I
Yeah.
will figure out how to get it done today and I will move things around and just honor myself and say, I'm not going to be able to get this thing to you today and feel okay about it.
Yes. There's a lot there. With the tears thing. A lot of my tears recently are either tears of admiration and tears of accomplishment.
Mm,
So, I'm in recovery from addiction, and whenever I hit clean time markers, I always cry.
yeah.
And I don't apologize for my tears. And one of my favorite things to do is to feel it go down my cheek.
Yeah, totally.
You know,
Yes. Yes.
and and
And then continuing down, like wetting your shirt. And yes.
like, especially when I'm not completely losing it, I like to just I like to sit there. I like to feel it go down my cheek for myself. I like to show a big part of our recovery program is the newcomer. It's very important. The newcomer is the most important person in the room. They're a big part of our recovery, and as a newcomer to come in and to see people who have long periods of clean time without picking up is probably one of the most impactful things. But then reminding ourselves that, as far as staying clean or not drinking or using anything, 24 hours is the all-time record.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's no years. It's just 24 hours at a time. Um, but then, I watched the Magic Johnson documentary on Apple TV. He's a basketball player from the 80s, and to just like every time he would achieve something, it was like, I want something like that. I have no hopes of ever being as great a man as Magic Johnson and all the accomplishments that he had. He is just an absolute superhero. But feeling like I um, I could potentially do something in my life that I would consider, on par with him. It's
Yeah.
almost like this. It's almost like feeling what part of what he must have felt through this documentary.
Yeah. Like kind of
That,
the inspiration.
yeah, the inspiration of it. And coming from the boys don't cry 70s.
Mm,
And, you know, like just explaining to my son that I was beaten with a stick in school, was paddled. He's like, "What are you talking about?" You
yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
he's like, what do you mean? He just has no no way to process that,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he his mom has a boyfriend who had two dogs, and one of the dogs died recently.
Oh.
Yeah, and Huck didn't cry in front of his mom. And then when he came up to see me, we were hanging out a little bit, and then it came up, and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm so sorry about that, buddy. Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm okay." I said, "Your mom told me that you didn't cry," and he was like, "No, I didn't cry." And then he looked over at me and he went, "He was my guard dog.
Oh.
He slept in my room," and he started crying. And I was like, get over here,
Oh,
buddy.
geez.
And
See the tears, like, it's
yeah, I
like,
mean, it's starting for
oh,
me too. And like,
yeah,
and he didn't want to cry. And I was like,
yeah,
little man, come here, cry,
yeah,
cry with me,
yes, yes, yeah,
and I held him, and he didn't want to cry. He's never heard boys don't cry from me
yeah,
or from his mom. I know we haven't taught him that. I don't
yeah.
know if he's ever heard that, but like for some reason he didn't want to cry. And I was like, buddy, it's okay.
Well, I think what it is that, like, when we have those feelings, it's like we sort of are anticipating that somebody's going to say, what's wrong and what do you need?
Yeah.
And in those moments, sorry, I'm going to get emotional.
Go ahead.
Like, you don't know what you need. You just
No.
know that, like, you need to experience what you're experiencing. Um, and so, what we can do in this world is hold space and um, be, right? It's like you don't need to do anything with that person potentially.
Yeah.
You can be with them. And one of the things that in like the a Today show interview that Brene Brown did, she was saying that, like, one of the questions she asks is like, what does love look like right now? What does support look like right now? Which I think is beautiful because it's more articulate than what do you need. It's
Yeah.
like, what's the love look like? What's the support look like? Because that's more descriptive and experiential. Whereas, like, what do we need is more logical, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that question, that way of asking those questions, when we're flooded with emotion, we're not in our head, we're in our heart. And so I think sometimes what keeps us unconsciously from expressing is we're not always given the space to just be in that. Like, people can kind of flood around us to, like, help fix the thing, and there's nothing to fix. Like, it's going to take as long as it takes.
Yeah.
Some people might take longer. Some people may not experience it right away, and it may take them a little bit of time to get into the feelings, and all of a sudden something will happen and it'll hit them, and then they'll start the grieving process or the healing process. And because there's no right answer. I mean, there's tips and everybody handles it differently. And I love that you just opened your eyes and or your arms and just said, come here. Because that's, like, really the most important thing in grief is just like, come here. It's like that safe space, like having my two friends there, like when I came down from this particular climb, like I was literally sobbing as I was climbing, and it was a choice, right? Like, I was choosing to be there and feel it and experience it, because it was like I was reclaiming my power in that, even though it was, like, really difficult. And when I came down, it was like wrapped me in their arms, right? And just, you did great. Like, whatever you need right now, like, I'm here for you. And it's like, oh man, like, how did I get so lucky to, like, find awesome humans that get how to do it? So if you don't have awesome humans that get how to do it and you're grieving, like, hit us up.
Yeah.
Or keep looking for those people. When you're in grief, it's difficult because you feel like this need to explain yourself, right? And then, like, tamp it down so that you don't make other people uncomfortable. And I know, like, yesterday, like, that was a part of the dialogue that I was having internally. And then I was like, I better express this externally, because I knew that I didn't need to explain myself to these people that didn't know about what has happened in my journey. But I needed somebody else to reassure me, because sometimes we do need that, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's, like, we're not meant to live by ourselves. We're not meant to grieve by ourselves. And I think that um we were talking a little bit about in the Jewish culture, that that's something like there's sort of this like this process that they actually have built into their culture and in their kind of religious rituals when somebody passes away. Do you want to share a little bit about sort of like I just think that was so interesting. You shared some things with me about just some of the things that you have experienced in your own healing journey of like having a therapist who also happened to be a rabbi, and
Yeah.
just that those perspectives that you gained from having somebody that's immersed in that culture. So I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, the idea of sitting Shiva is a 7-day period of mourning where the idea is to celebrate, process, and go through a lot of the grief processes. And I had this wonderful counselor who was a licensed psychotherapist as well as a rabbi. And for me personally, I want a counselor that has the scientific and the spiritual bent,
Yeah.
because one is incomplete without the other. And so whenever we would go through all of the things that I was talking with him about, generally he wore his psychotherapist hat, but I would always make him give me, the spiritual side of it. So I would say, okay, so what does Judaism say about this?
No, that's not how you phrased it. You were like,
What
what does the rabbi say?
Yeah, what does the rabbi say about
I think
this?
that's much more powerful. It's like, all right, therapist, thanks for
Yeah,
that, doctor.
yeah, thanks.
And also,
And what does the rabbi say about it? And like that was always, it was almost always the more interesting piece of it for me, the more applicable piece of it for me. And I really came to respect Judaism as a whole, because it was like we were dealing with issues that were um, possibly from a Christianity standpoint, it was a matter of, my sexual desires and what I wanted to do. And I had to be honest with it. And, if I feel like if I would have asked a Christian pastor about it, they would have been like, well, just be more pure, don't think those
right,
things,
yeah,
don't
like
do those things.
some of the shame would have kind of maybe been
Yeah.
entered into it.
Yeah. And like, the rabbi, I was just like, wow, like you are practical, like,
Yeah.
like you're taking the reality of the situation and really applying what can be applied to it. So that was something that I really came to love about having a therapist that wore both of those hats. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's
And because
the
I think what, like you were saying, like we're not we like we were saying before this episode, that we're not taught how to grieve. And so it's interesting that there's this, this religion, this culture within Judaism that it's sort of like there's like a model, there's like a process, there's actually like an expectation
yeah.
that
You
you're
want
going to
you want to hear
take that
something? I mean,
time.
this is down and dirty. You
Okay.
want to hear something
I
like
mean, if this is a vulnerability moment, then you got to choose it.
this is
I'm always
okay.
here for it.
I've told this story to numerous people, but I'll just say that like when I was within my marriage, I was going crazy with sexual desire. I was just like like I want to stray,
Mm,
and so we talked about it, and this is the point where I was like, well, what does the rabbi say about this?
hmm.
And he said, well, and this is between he and I, so I'm not speaking for Judaism or any religion. Okay. This
Sure.
is what he said to me.
Right.
He said, well, if you're going to do it, back in the day, they'd say, wear black, go to another town, do what you got to do. And then that's it. And I said, well, why do you wear black? He said, because part of you dies.
Mm, yeah, it's true, right? Like when we have, you know, and I think, oh man, wow, we should pin this and talk about this in another
Is that
episode.
crazy? I mean, I was just like,
Well, I
whoa.
think what it is it's like when you, and remember, like when there's death, there's also rebirth, right? Like, because we die and then we go back into the earth and then it creates, I mean, everything is a cycle. So I think that that's really cool. But um, when we have values,
Yeah.
and then like obviously the fact that you are having these desires and then questioning those desires, there was some value boundary that you were
Yeah.
crossing.
Yeah.
And yeah, like if you're gonna not honor your truth, a part of you dies when
Yeah.
that happens. And what a beautiful, I mean, a little messed up, and also what
Yeah.
what a beautiful truth. And I think that we have opportunities every single day, and I think that that's what happens at the end of our day, right? Like we set expectations for ourselves. This episode is like so interesting because it's like it started off as grief, but it's like morphing into something else. But I think when we feel these feelings of oh, I had all these goals and I wanted to do these things, and I wanted to check these things off of my to-do list, and I wanted to be this kind of mom today, or that kind of daughter today, or this kind of friend today. And then we get to the end of the day and then we look backwards and we're like, well, I was just a pile of garbage because I didn't do those things. Like you're grieving that.
Yeah.
And that's where it's important, I think, to like really look at it and evaluate it and say like, oh, okay, like I understand why I'm feeling that feeling. And what do I want to do with it? Like that's always the thing, like what do I want to do with it? Like I'll mention his name again, David Kessler. Like he's an expert on grief and loss. Like what's the meaning in the loss? And I think in this episode we'll definitely put some links to some of the resources that we're mentioning here, because I think it's interesting to have this perspective of like, I mean, there's losses every day, right? Like at the end of the day, like we don't get the time back. Like that 24 hours is gone. What you did with it, you might grieve that you didn't do what you wanted to do with it. But if we get to the how are we being instead of what are we doing, I think being allows us to actually experience grief instead of worrying so much about like, I got to get it all cleaned up. Like that's a doing task, and just like, I'll let that be there.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to let that be there for a moment and know that we can get it all cleaned up. Like know that like tomorrow you can reevaluate in that moment how you want to be. Man, there's just so many great things that this topic could uncover around life, relationships, and business. Thank you, Paul, for being open and to having this conversation today. I think it was a really interesting one, and we try to bring levity and lightness to difficult things.
So I'm glad you kept the feather boa on the whole time.
I know I was going to take it off, but I left it on.
Good. Well, thanks a lot, Alison. Another great episode. I wanted to let our listeners know that we have recorded a podcast about the episode that Alison was speaking about in one of our past episodes. So please like, follow, and share, and dig into some of our previous episodes, because there's a lot of gold in those and a lot of backstory.
Yeah, episode 4 in particular.
Yeah, a lot of authenticity. We're really trying to talk about the things that matters, the conversations about how the soul lights the way through life, relationships, and business. Soul Talks with Prophet and Paul.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody.